welcome to Liberty Unlocked. I'm Don Watkins. So in this show, our focus is on how to be more persuasive advocates for liberty. And typically we are looking at that through the issue of communication. That is, how do we most effectively communicate pro-liberty ideas? But I think there's a wider discussion to have around the question of how to build a persuasive liberty movement. And let me say a little bit about what I mean by that. That is, I think a movement that has certain features about it that can be attractive or repulsive. And so we need to think, well, how do we build one that attracts? Now, there's an idea that's very common, particularly amongst some libertarians, the idea of you want to be a big tent. You want to be as inviting to as many people as possible. And there's something really appealing about that, right? Like if you're trying to win an election, you have to get a majority or at least a plurality of supporters. And so you want to be able to have your door open to all of those potential supporters, and you wouldn't want to shut anybody off. But I think we have to take really seriously where we are today. And where we are today is that there is nothing resembling a plurality or a majority, certainly, of voters anywhere in the United States that genuinely supports liberty or anything like it. And so in that kind of circumstance, you can't be thinking about it in terms of how do we get people to raise their hand automatically and say, hey, your agenda sounds great. We have to be thinking about what it takes to create a movement that is able to significantly transform hearts and minds. And the goal being that in a few years, 5, 10, 15, we can at least start to build real, let's call it election coalitions that maybe in certain places can start winning elections, but that persuasion, effective persuasion, actually getting people to support liberty today requires not focusing on trying to find people who will already be ready to agree, but in creating a movement and articulating arguments that are so compelling that you can change a lot of minds, many of them very dramatically. And so with that in mind, part of what I've spent a lot of time thinking about is, well, what are the ideas that such a movement has to stand for and say, look, to be part of our movement, this is what you have to support. And what do you have to repudiate? Now, one of the views that I think any pro-liberty movement has to repudiate, and we've talked about this in various places on this show, is anarchism, because I think it's a disreputable position. I don't think it represents liberty or anything close to liberty. I think it represents the antithesis of liberty, even if there are a lot of supporters who you could say, in effect, their hearts are in the right place, that the position itself has to be treated as, this is not part of our movement. This is not what we stand for. That we don't view it as a minor difference about whether you have a government or no government. I mean, that's like saying, the only difference between me and my friend is, I'm married to the woman of my dreams, and like he's divorced, right? Like that's not a minor difference in the context of marriage, and whether or not you have a government is not a minor difference in the context of politics. And so, but there's another idea or set of ideas that I think are, from one perspective, more controversial than what I just said, but in another perspective, less controversial. And that's the issue of religion. Now, I don't think that you could or should try to think of, all right, a liberty movement is going to take a position on religion per se. Now, I think personally, and this should come as a surprise to nobody who listens to this show, that ultimately, to have a consistent, compelling defense of freedom and definition of freedom, you need the philosophic base that Ayn Rand outlines in Objectivism. I don't think a liberty movement could only or should only consist of objectivists. I think about it much closer, though, with some additional caveats to, you need something like the classical liberal tradition, which was not subjectivist and anarchist. It was the Enlightenment ideals, where man is a rational animal who has free will and has to guide his life and can guide his life by his mind, and therefore has to be free from force. And so we have to organize a society to take the initiation of force out of the public square, put it under objective control under a government. And in the last show, Brad Thompson, we talked about his book, and he has a really good breakdown, the kind of basic philosophic views that were around during the Enlightenment, that despite all of the differences of the thinkers, there was this kind of common way of coming at things. And I think you need something like that. So you can't just have shared political views. There have to be deeper views in philosophy, but I don't think it needs to be like, oh, everybody's going to agree with Ayn Rand about every piece of it. And I do think that there probably have to be certain kind of moral views. I think ultimately, at least, there needs to be agreement that our goal is human flourishing, and that means the flourishing of individuals. It's not some kind of collective flourishing that we can sacrifice individuals to. So there has to be that kind of outlook. But then how does religion fit into that? And I would say I distinguish between two kinds of things. So one is, you could have a view that, look, the grounding, the basis for liberty is that human beings have a certain nature, and that in order to flourish, they need freedom because of that nature. That in order to be able to live by our judgment, we have to be free to exercise our judgment, and that is going to be the foundation, our basic moral, philosophic argument for liberty. Now, you could have that view and be a religious person who thinks, yeah, ultimately it was God who determined what man's nature was going to be, but that your argument doesn't depend on that. And this is a point actually George Will has made. George Will is, a conservative who has explicitly said you don't need religion as a basis for a political argument, that the foundation, as he puts, is, what are the requirements of human flourishing? And I think ultimately that's right, that you can have agreement by religious people and non-religious people. Now, I think in the end, a religious society, a society that takes religion seriously, won't support that kind of argument, but certainly any given individual religious person can, and historically many of them have. Now, that is very different from a view which says the argument for freedom that we're going to offer is based in religion. So this is the kind of view that says, like, our basic foundational principle is human beings have rights. Why? Because God put them in us, which treats rights as just this mystical principle. And as Ayn Rand pointed out throughout her life, what that means is that reason and science are on the side of statism. That it's, well, if you want to be scientific and just reject faith and go exclusively by the human mind, you have to reject freedom and embrace totalitarianism. Well, then you're going to lose the better people, and your movement loses the scientific high ground. And the scientific high ground, the rational high ground, the logical high ground, these are really important things that any movement that wants to win over supporters has to have. And I mean, you can see that in a lot of the debates, the way in which the right and conservatives get beaten down, and legitimately beaten down, for being anti-science. Now, some of it's not legitimate. I think but there a big part of it is. I think there's part of, let's call it the Republican Party or the Republican landscape, that is not just anti-science, but defiantly anti-science, because they have this kind of umbrella view of, we resent and oppose the elites. Who are you to think you're smarter than us and tell us what to do? And part of it is this kind of idea of, we don't want central planners dictating our lives because they think they're so smart. But part of it is a real rejection of intelligence and a real rejection of science. And you cannot have a reputable movement, and particularly a movement that ultimately rests on a respect for reason and has to rest on a respect for reason, that is going to lose the scientific high ground, and that's going to imply that there's no rational basis for organizing a society by rights. And then, I mean, it creates all kinds of other problems too, besides persuasion, which is, if your view of rights is really there's these mystical things and we can't say where they came from or why we have them, or then you can't even define what they are, and you can't actually use them to govern a society, then unless you see rights as flowing out of man's nature and securing his ability to flourish, you can't actually implement the principle of rights. So I think the religious kind of view has to be out as a basis for the argument for freedom. Now, I should also add that the left doesn't. I mean, part of why the pro-freedom side needs to have and take the scientific high ground is precisely because the left doesn't deserve it either. That if you think about the kind of democratic sea that people swim in, what it really amounts to is, well, you just need to take orders from scientists and treat them as authorities who get to tell us what to do without even having to supply reasons, and we can't push back and ask questions. And so if they tell us, hey, we're going to lock you up for 9 months or whatever, well, you just have to be locked up, or otherwise you're anti-science. Or if they say, hey, you have to starve yourself of energy by banning fossil fuels, well, who are we to question that? No, you have to, the way Alex Epstein puts it, treat scientists as and experts more generally as advisors, not authorities. But they're important advisors, and so if we're thinking more broadly, I think you need a pro-science, pro-reason movement, and that means rejecting any form of faith, any form of religion, any form of mysticism as the foundation argument for freedom, and say that, no, if that's your view, that has nothing to do with our movement. This is a movement that has a fully rational basis, and we can disagree about exactly how to formulate that rational basis or how to deal with certain particular issues, but this is a movement based on reason, based on valuing human flourishing, the flourishing of individuals, and therefore leading to a government that protects individual rights. And I think that those are kind of the skeletons that have to make up a liberty movement that actually stands for liberty and that can actually provide a compelling case for liberty. So all of which, that is to say that my guest today is a really interesting guy I've met a long time ago, actually, before I got started in my career as a pro-freedom writer and writing on the issue of objectivism. And that's Fred Seiler. And Fred's a really interesting guy, and he wrote a book. Let me just make sure I get the title right. God versus Nature, the Conflict Between Religion and Science and History. And it's a really fascinating book, both for its content, but as we'll talk about a lot in the episode, the way it's written. Fred really understands the history of science, the history of religion, and he's able to present some of the most enormously complex ideas that you could present, and spanning throughout history and all different spheres of human life, and present them in a really simple, clarifying way without ever being simplistic and without you, the reader, feeling talked down to. And I really admired that. It's something that I've strived to really achieve in my own writing. And so I think it's a good example of what it means to be able to write simply, but not simplistically. And so I encourage people to read the book. I haven't read every word of it, but the pieces I have read have been stellar, particularly from this perspective of the clear communication of difficult ideas. And I think that you'll enjoy this conversation. So be sure to like this video, subscribe to the podcast or YouTube channel, and be sure to hit that bell if you're on YouTube. And as always, the best way to stay in contact is to go to donswriting.com and sign up for the newsletter. Quick thanks to everybody who's supporting this show and all my activities. It makes a big difference. So you can go to donswriting.com to the support page in the upper right-hand corner, and even $5 or $10 a month makes a huge difference in making sure that we can put out a lot of really high quality content for free so that as many people as possible can become as effective champions of freedom as possible. Now, on to the conversation with Fred Seiler. Thanks for coming aboard, Fred. So we met, actually, you're one of the first objectivists I ever met, because this was way back before I ever worked at the Ayn Rand Institute, as I recall. And David Ream and I, primarily David, decided to try to get together some people interested in Ayn Rand's ideas in the DC metro area. And what do you remember about that period?
We had some interesting discussions. We had some good meetings. I enjoyed that group. I think it's sort of gone on since then. It doesn't really exist in that state anymore. But that was a lot of fun. I remember at some point you started your own newsletter too about it's related to objectivism. Um, I think
Yeah, no,
that was around that time, and before then you left for the Ayn Rand Institute. I remember that then.
yeah, I mean, there was this was an interesting period in that it was kind of the tail end right before I think the internet really became kind of the meeting grounds and interacting zone, because this was before social media, but after people were interacting in one way or another
Mhm.
online.
Right.
And I was really thought that there was a need for some kind of publication where people interested in Rand's ideas could discuss them. And I didn't necessarily consider myself fully qualified to do it, but I was just of the attitude of, well, nobody else is doing it, so why don't I give it a shot? And I mean, the major challenge was just finding people capable of writing at a high level about these ideas. And so one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you is you wrote a book, God and Nature. I forget the subtitle. Can you help me out with that one?
Yeah, sure. The subtitle is The Conflict Between Religion and Science in History.
And one of the things I found really uh, exciting about it is that it's very difficult. It's very difficult to talk about complicated ideas to people who are not scholars and who don't have the kind of like vocabulary and context to make those ideas relatively easily graspable. And one of the strengths I always thought I brought to the table with my books, particularly the ones I did with Huron Brook, was the ability to take in very complicated ideas in philosophy and economics and history and psychology and make them really accessible. And I feel like you've really done a superb job of doing that with epistemological, metaphysical, scientific ideas, and made things just really straightforward and clear. So I want to talk about
Thank you.
that. But before we get into that, let's just start out with sort of your background and how you became interested in ideas in the first place.
Um, I guess got interested in ideas very early. So I think probably when I was very young, I think my grandfather was a science teacher. He loved to give me books on science. So I remember reading books about astronomy and things when I was very young and getting excited. And I think when I got into high school, I was in middle school, high school, I was reading some science fiction books and I started thinking more philosophically. And that's when I think at a certain point, I was always at church. My parents always took me to church. And at a certain point, they went to confirmation class. And at a certain point, I said, ideas don't really make much sense to me. And I basically said, I'm not going to get confirmed. I don't really agree with any of this. And I read a certain amount of philosophy at that time in high school. And um, what else can I say? I went into engineering. I went into electrical engineering, and as um, let's see, studied at Rensselaer Polytech, and then graduate work at Carnegie Mellon. But I was always studying philosophy on the side. I got interested in Ayn Rand right after I graduated high school. Um, so yeah, that's sort of my background. And then at a certain point, I decided to go back. Um, After working as an engineer for a couple of years, I decided I really wanted to try a more academic career, humanities type thing, and see what was possible. And there are departments in related to the philosophy of science, history of and philosophy of science. So I actually got into the department at Indiana University, a department of history and philosophy of science, which is actually one of the better programs like it, more rational programs like that. Different places like different large universities tend to have like departments in science and technology studies or certain things about the history of science and medicine, things like that. Indiana seemed to be really good in terms of being relatively objective, focused on the science. So I ended up going there, and I spent 2 years there getting my master's degree. It was really fascinating field. In certain ways, I really loved it because you really get to dive into the original writings of a lot of scientists. I remember taking a graduate class on the writings of Isaac Newton and just going into a lot of depth into certain aspects of his Principia and his other writings and evolution of his life and his biography. That was really fascinating. So now I decided that really as an academic career that wasn't very viable. So I ended up going back into engineering. But while I was at Indiana, I started learning. I studied learning about, well, what are academic historians of science saying about religion? And I discovered that they talk about religion and science and history. I discovered that they really have turned away from the idea that there's any real conflict at all between religion and science, and that was a shock to me at that time.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly bled into the culture that there's a new conventional wisdom that's different even than when I was, say, in high school, which wasn't that long ago, all things considered, where you just took it for granted that at least there's many people think that there's a tension. And now it's kind of like, no, we all know better than that, unless you're kind of like, a dinosaur who's prejudiced against one or the other.
Right.
I found it interesting that it was during your confirmation that you kind of stepped back and said, I don't agree with this. For me, it was literally right after, like, I got confirmed, and which at least in the Methodist world is basically you're like 13 or so, and then like you hang out and they tell you a bunch of stuff that you're supposed to believe, and then you say, I believe it, and now you're a confirmed member of the church. But it was shortly after that where I started getting interested in philosophy, because what happened was I finished that, and afterwards I said, I should probably actually figure out for myself which religion is true. Which, I mean, this is the whole ridiculousness of doing it at 13, right? This is precisely before people have learned to ask independent questions like, what do I believe and how do I make those assessments?
Yeah.
And then, pretty soon I knew I was an atheist, and my act of rebellion was mostly when my parents took me to church, read Nietzsche and then ask annoying questions about biblical contradictions. But so I've always been, religion and atheism were the first ideas I became interested in. And then it was actually only because of that I became interested in science at all. I'm not naturally interested in science. I find it intriguing when there's a guide who can kind of explain it to me. But I just remember I went to a good friend's house one night, and he was telling us, the details of the stars and the constellations and everything. And I was like, oh, this is amazing. And I walked out that night going, oh, I can't wait to buy a book on astronomy. And then I thought, wait, no, I don't actually care about this. I love his enthusiasm for it and ability to bring it alive. I've talked to a lot of people in the show about what attracts them to more what you can think of as the humanities side of ideas. What did you find fascinating about what we typically think of as science, like natural sciences?
Oh, well, that's going back quite a bit. So, because I've always been interested in science. I always loved science. So
well, if it's not where it came from, what is it? Even if it's not necessarily where it originated for you, as you try to articulate it as an adult, what do you find so gripping? I mean, to the point where you were ready to set on an academic career.
I mean, the fact that people did have could really know things that are in many ways very distant and very, very far from the perceptual level. And that we could know about the existence of atoms, even though we couldn't really see atoms. We could infer that. We could know about all these properties of distant galaxies, distant objects in the sky, even though, we couldn't really physically see a lot of that detail. We could see a lot of things and do a lot of inferences from that. And the power of those kinds of inferences is always kind of impressed me. And also just the interesting aspects of looking at fossils and other things and trying to infer what were these creatures like, the ancient creatures that don't exist anymore, and dinosaurs. How can we figure out what they were like, and how did people know so much I was impressed by that probably at a fairly young age.
I mean, that makes a lot of sense to me, because I think part of what I resisted is that the way science is always presented is just, here's a bunch of facts that seem pretty remote from my life. And it's all treated as obvious. And how do we know this? Well, we just know this. And one of the stories I think you have at the very beginning of your book, you have two stories, like little vignettes. One is about in France, a girl who says that she sees the Virgin Mary, and people in the town, after some skepticism, believe her. They believe they're
Right.
being visited by her. And this is symbolizing or concretizing kind of the religious way of looking at the world. And then you tell a story, which I had never heard this particular example before, of the man who kind of discovered at least the essentials of the circulatory system.
William Harvey, right.
And you describe the kind of steps he went through, and feel free to give a little bit of concretes to that. But to me, it's when you see the process of discovery, because you think, yeah, how would people figure out where's blood going? What's it for? Like, it's not obvious at
It
all.
is not.
And then
Right.
you see the like literally ingenuity used to, well, how could we figure this out? And I found that startling, and that just, it immediately put me in your book, where I might not know the details of epistemology as somebody just coming to this book, but I can see there's a real different way of approaching understanding the world here.
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, that was part of what I was trying to do by putting those two little vignettes right at the beginning, is sort of just give you some real simple concretes just to put into the reader's mind. Here's something very different, things going on here in these two. And then with Harvey, yeah, it's a great story. It's a great example, because it's, he really looked carefully at a lot of evidence, different kinds of evidence. He did experiments with showing what happens actually to your pulse, and if you just block certain types of veins in your arm, and you could do these kinds of simple experiments on your own arm, and then trying to integrate that with information about, people had been dissecting bodies for a while, since Vesalius had done a great job doing dissections. This was about 100 years before him, that Andres Vesalius had really dramatically illustrated the whole human body in many ways. And they had shown that the veins and the arteries have these valves in them, and they were tended to point downwards, or I'm sorry, they tended to point upwards. So people thought, well, this has to do with gravity. And that's the main point of these veins, is to keep everything from going downward. Everybody, I mean, this goes back to Galen, because Galen proposed the idea that the blood is somehow generated within the core of the body, and then it just sort of dissipates and is sent out to the rest of the body, and it's used up. And it's continually generated somehow out of the food, and it just is somehow used up as it goes. So it doesn't go in the circulatory system at all.
And then there was a calculation of like how much blood would actually be generated. What was
right.
Like,
right. And he just, yeah. And he did experiments. So he took like a blood of an animal, which was similar in size to a human heart. And he killed the animal, and he looked at how much blood was coming out of its heart at the moment he killed it. And he could see exactly, and he measured like the size of the heart, and how much volume of blood could be stored in that heart. And he knew exactly how much blood could be stored in a human heart. So he just did these simple calculations with the rate of the heartbeats, and he just figured out, this is insane. This can't be true, that we can't generate this much blood. It must be going on in some sort of a circle.
So if you just thought about it cold, like, all right, we have a girl who says she sees the Virgin Mary, and we believe her even though nobody else sees it, and it doesn't integrate with anything else that we know. Versus the kind of processing and methodical processing and connection to what we can perceive, that you see a scientist going through. On the face of it, these realms, if they're reaching conclusions that conflict, and they would have to reach conclusions that conflict, you'd think, all right, there's a real clash here, at least sometimes on some crucial matters. So what is the argument for, no, there doesn't have to be a conflict between religion and science?
Well, historians like to give examples. I'm talking about a lot of the number one, a lot of the scientists, most of the scientists in history have been religious in some degree, in some way. If you look at Copernicus, I mean, Copernicus was he was an official within the Catholic Church. If you look at Gregor Mendel, who discovered the basics about genetics, he was a monk. So, and then if you also look at a lot of statements by certain scientists, I mean, if you look, let's say during the scientific revolution, the core, let's say the 17th century, there were quite a few scientists who were saying, my science I'm excited by what I'm discovering. This is amazing. I'm discovering the nature of God. I see this as a religious experience. And you had, I mean, there are certain scientists like Robert Boyle, who is sort of a chemist, physicist kind of person. He did experiments with air pumps. He discovered what's known as Boyle's law from chemistry classes. You might remember Boyle's law, which relates the volume of a gas and the pressure and its temperature. He wrote a lot about how his Christian faith, his faith was so important, and it was part of being a scientist. And in fact, he wrote a book which argued that being a scientist makes you a better Christian. And he wasn't the only person who did things like that, certainly during the 17th century, especially in England. There were a lot of ministers in England who were dabbling in science on the side, and they had a lot of fun with it, and they learned some kind of interesting little things here and there. So those are the kind of examples historians give. Also, what you find is, I think not as much from people who are pure historians, but from people who are sort of more committed to religion will come at this, and they'll try to argue that, well, Judeo-Christian ideas really are the core of where science came from, because God gave us this idea of there's these laws that he's imposed on the world, on reality. And so this conscious mind, the mind of God, is a rational mind, and he's created these laws, and he's created reality according to these laws. Now we have to go and find out those laws. So in that sense, there are certain people who have been arguing for decades now that it was Christianity that was actually responsible for the rise of science.
How did they square that kind of argument with the fact that the Greeks were certainly interested in laws of nature? Now, they didn't get to mathematical science or anything like that, but there was definitely like a search for kind of the principles that explained the world around them.
They really do their best to minimize the Greeks and to basically say, no, they were doing pre-science. They weren't really. I think they try to ignore and evade what the Greeks did.
I mean, that doesn't surprise me, because it's definitely, I think they do that on a much wider scale than just kind of the issue of science. Even explaining what was unique of the whole Enlightenment is in their portrayal. This is fundamentally a Christian discovery and creation versus Ayn Rand's way of looking at it, which I think is actually borne out by the history, which is that it was a clash between the Greek and the Christian. It was the overtaking of the Greek influence that really explains the Enlightenment. So I want to get to all that, but I want to raise one other part of their objection. So I think there's been a trend over the last decade or so of, on top of the points you just made, taking the kind of most symbolic examples of the conflict between religion and science and trying to, if you want to call it, whitewash or minimize or change, basically reinterpret. So I've heard, Galileo wasn't actually persecuted for his beliefs. I'd like to hear your comment on that. I don't even recall offhand exactly what their argument is. The Dark Ages wasn't really that dark. There was all kinds of progress and,
Mhm.
learning and so on. So if you could address those, if you have any thoughts, but then I'd like to hear sort of what your take is then on, given their kind of arguments, why you still think it's important to see that there is in some important way a conflict between.
Yeah. Well, let me go back to the Dark Ages, because I think um, there certainly were there were a little bit of science. There was a little bit of science that was done in the Dark Ages. But if you really look at the volume, and partly I put a lot of detail into the chapter on the ancient Greeks, because I wanted to give the reader an appreciation, because a lot of people really don't appreciate. They know something about the ancient Greeks, did some scientific work, but they don't appreciate how really deeply they were thinking about these issues, and how much things that were sort of like, in some respects, experiments, very simple experiments, detailed observations, and reasoning from them that they were doing. And then if you contrast that with what was going on in the Dark Ages, where it was really essentially no science. There were you I guess you start to see tiny bits of figures here and there around 1100s, 1200s, I think. You might see a churchman here or there who might be noted because he did some observations about the rainbow. Um, and but if you look, and then there was, let's say, Roger Bacon, who was a British churchman. I think he was right around 1200s, and he started doing some simple observations and reasoning about light, but I don't think he came up with anything particularly interesting. Um, so there were, I mean, if you study hard enough, you study this period of well over 1,000 years. And if you look hard enough, as historians have done, you will find examples of people discovering new things. But if you contrast that with the ancient Greeks, what they did, and then the scientific revolution, the Renaissance and the scientific revolution, and everything that's come after that, the Dark Ages certainly deserve the term Dark Ages. They certainly were dark, certainly relatively speaking, very dark.
Well, I think that's the important point. The important point is there is a big difference between, like, just look at it in the realm of technology. There's a big difference between once every 100 years, we get a slight improvement to the way that we do some task, to an ongoing culture of improvement such that within your lifetime, what we know and how we live is
Mhm.
noticeably different. And I think if you look at the Greeks, there's like over a period of several centuries, what somebody knew at the beginning of their life. Now it didn't permeate through the culture exactly in the same way, because they hadn't yet figured out how to apply most of these ideas, to my understanding, to certainly to technology and whatever. But that you have a real growth of knowledge that you're seeing and experiencing. And certainly since the Enlightenment, I mean, there's no question, like the phone we used last year is mostly irrelevant to the phone we use this year. And so saying, oh, we can eke out, like, I don't think anybody's made the claim that, in the Dark Ages, literally nobody had a single scientific thought. And so it's kind of a straw man sort of attack. What about the Galileo case, though? Because I
Yeah,
think there's, in the end, you know, the truth of the kind of basic issues you're raising, I don't think hinge on symbols, but symbols are important, particularly I mean, Galileo was seen as a real symbol for the Enlightenment and the thinkers, and their attitude towards what are the threats to our ability to live by reason and function by reason. And so I think it's revealing whenever a symbol is deliberately tried to be torn down.
right, right, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, this is certainly the trend in books on Galileo over the last 20, 30 years. There have been a series of major works on Galileo which have basically argued that that Galileo is not so much in conflict with religion as anybody thought, and that's sort of a myth. In fact, there was a book, interesting little book that was published maybe 10 years ago, it was a series of articles for popular audience by academic historians of science, and it's called Galileo Goes to Jail and Other Myths About Science and Religion. And it has a chapter on Galileo, which is the same basic idea. But I think the main point that these make, and I think the historians who are doing this are generally, they look at the facts of history. I don't think there's any kind of, I don't think they, I think they're honest when they look at particular facts of history. They're really there, and I think they talk about specific documents, what are written in documents, what happened this year, what happened this year, what did such and such figure say. When you look at those specific details, I think they're basically getting the story right. It comes down to a lot of interpretation details as to what is the significance of all this. And certainly there have been, if you go back to earlier views, people have said that Galileo was tortured, was physically tortured, which is not the case, is not true. And people have said that Galileo was what else would they say? That he was kept in a prison, an actual full prison, which was not quite the case. He was under various forms of house arrest. But I think they try to bring up certain details about the case and put special highlight on them as though saying, this is what it's really about. It's not about science versus religion. So for example, they'll talk about Galileo. He had this kind of acerbic wit and personality, and he really liked to attack people who he thought were stupid and were saying stupid things. And so he could, once he started, insulting people, a lot of people got very offended and very upset. And so people say, well, he offended too many of the people who didn't like him. And they basically ganged up on him and got the Inquisition to go after him. That's one issue that came up. Another issue is that, well, his dialogues in which he so-called proves that the Earth orbits the sun rather than the other way around, his main proof has to do with the tides. And it turns out, and we know this now, that Galileo was wrong. He did not quite understand the tides. He didn't understand the significance of the moon gravity on the tides. And he thought that using the fact of the tides, he could make that as big evidence that the Earth is actually moving. So he was wrong about that. Let me think what else they bring up here. Trying to think, if I just quickly skip to this chapter, I can remind myself of what else he brought up here. They point out that the Pope had political problems, and he needed to be seen as strong, and so he needed to deal with the situation because it was getting kind of embarrassing. And this is one which is kind of strange, but they say, well, the church did not convict Galileo of quote unquote heresy. Well, it turns out they have a lesser charge, which they call vehement suspicion of heresy. That's the term they use. It's vehement suspicion of heresy. And there's a stronger charge, which is what's called the charge of heresy itself. But so officially they charged him with vehement suspicion of heresy, not heresy. So historians like to have taken a lot of these little details and say, see, you've got Galileo all wrong. It's really a complicated issue. And it's not so much about science versus religion. And I think, there's one thing looking at this, people say, well, if he had played his cards better, he could have gotten away with this without getting under such trouble, with the Inquisition.
Yeah, my reaction to that, and I'm interested in yours, is, first of all, you could say the same thing about Socrates. You could say the same thing basically about anybody who is suppressed by an unjust laws. Well, hey, like, I mean, this is really, to put it provocatively, the like she asked for it because she wore a short dress type argument. Like and but if you think about the actual context, right? Like it's um they have laws that penalize people for speaking out against the church, and then they
Right.
penalize somebody for speaking out against the church. And I do think it's valuable and important. I'm glad people have given us what is everything we know about specifically what really happened, but it's important to be able to grasp what is the essential. So for example,
Right.
the aspect that you talked about, that there was political machinations and incentives, well, that's certainly true. And then you should ask, well, what's the relationship between political systems where people have unbridled power to carry out things that benefit them versus having to respect the rights of people in society? And you can think about what's the role of religion in helping promote and protect that way of life. So there's a way in which the historians are doing something good, but if you don't have a deeper perspective and try to think about what's really essential here, you'll get nowhere in terms of your thinking. All you'll be able to say is, well, this isn't like the fairy tale version that we heard, which, I mean, people have done the same thing to kind of discredit the founding fathers. As well, George Washington didn't really just cut down a cherry tree and tell the truth, and they had flaws and made mistakes and they had different incentives. So who can say that America is a great achievement?
And then you find some historians that they really tend to have a I think Ayn Rand used the term uh, now I'm forgetting the term. It was a statistical mentality.
Hmm.
You know, that you have to, that they just look at all these little statistics and then they try to come up with their basic overall ideas just by coming up with some statistical generalities and things like that. So there was a British historian of science named John Heilbrunn, and he's written a number of books on history of science I consider very good. But in one of his books, he comes up with this statement. He's studying during the 17th century. Um, this is the period Galileo was convicted. He was convicted in 1633. Um, and during the 17th century, well, John Heilbrunn's book is not about Galileo as much. It's about certain other developments in physics. And he talks a lot about, well, the Catholic Church was giving a lot of money and supporting a lot of priests who were doing little experiments having to do with static electricity and things related to static electricity. So then he comes up with this statement. He says that the greatest supporter of science in the 17th century was the Catholic Church. And he doesn't try to relate that to Galileo or anything. He just sort of says, oh, there's my conclusion. And you're wondering, what were you thinking? How does this relate to Galileo and other things going on at this time? And the supporting of people who were writing garbage against Galileo, and after Galileo, they were supporting all sorts of books which were incredibly garbage, talking about their proofs that the Earth is at the center of the universe. So I thought that, and then you see a few other historians here and there who I respect in many ways coming out with similar kinds of statements like that.
So how would you state, in a broad sense, then, how you see the relationship between these two forces in human life, uh, science and religion?
Yeah, I mean, I think at a fundamental philosophical level, science and religion really are at a deep conflict, and the conflict between the way it's been expressed by many, which I agree, is between faith and reason, and that faith is basically taking one's emotions, one's as a starting point, taking a book or a holy book or authority as a starting point, and reason is based on observation. And that's sort of, reason is the base of science, and faith is based in the base of religion. So I think at some level going into this, you have to see there's something really important distinction here. And then I also talk about how I think there's a more deep philosophical issue underlying that. And I have this chapter about talking about axioms of philosophy, and I talk about the primacy of existence versus the primacy of consciousness, and how faith really ultimately comes down to the primacy of consciousness of one form or another. This view that consciousness, a mind, is something that is fundamentally creative, versus the primacy of existence, which is the view that existence exists, and a mind, the basic thing a mind does, or consciousness does, is become aware of that, and then can guide us in our lives through reality. So I try to reduce it to these very fundamental, metaphysical ideas.
Yeah, and if people are interested in that, obviously read Fred's book, but also see the first I think 4 or 5 episodes of my commentaries on objectivism, the philosophy of Ayn Rand, where I give kind of the way that Leonard Peikoff talks about these ideas. You go into, I think, the other kind of central peg of the religion versus science debate, which, I, it's one of those things. Every few years, I think it's gone away, and people have finally given up the fight, and then it peeks its head out again, and that's the evolution and natural selection debate. Right. What is the most interesting thing that you think that debate reveals, or that people don't understand about the debate over natural selection versus more religious interpretations?
It's an interesting question. I think for me, that was a relatively straightforward chapter, in that I'm probably in that chapter more than any other. There have been a lot of other good books written about that issue. So I weren't any big surprises by it. I mean, I'm thinking in my research of that issue, what surprised me the most. It certainly was interesting that a lot of schools around the world now are apparently omitting the topic of evolution.
I mean, to me, that's part of the most troublesome thing, and there's a lot of troublesome things. First of all, the polling about how many people don't believe in evolution is terrifying in many ways. It's that, I mean, if you really took seriously like what it means to be an educated, reasonable person, there's a lot of areas where people can have disagreements and confusions or everything. But this is, I think, so clear cut that it's almost on the same level as somebody who walked around and said, no, the sun moves around the earth and the earth is fixed. Like, it's that kind of well established. Yeah. And so what's striking to me is that the extent to which even people who believe in natural selection as the mechanism for evolution and evolution more broadly will concede that there's even a debate still. That, well, it's a complicated issue or something like that. And part of what makes it complicated is that there is such a thing as people who basically have ideas purely on faith. And yet what it usually looks like to have ideas on faith is that you have lots of arguments, but the arguments are not why you hold the view that you do. They're after the fact attempts to support and rationalize. And if those are knocked down, you don't change your conclusion, you change your arguments. Right. That's, I think, the one of the most important things to be able to see in that debate is the way in which it's not a search for truth, it's a search for justifying a belief and getting that that's not reason. Like, that's not what it means to be scientific.
Right. Absolutely. One of the other interesting things, I'm not sure if I included that in this chapter, but one thing I learned is that in Europe, this used to be a thing just in the United States, creationism, how big creationism is. But with all of there's a lot of immigration of Muslims into Europe. And suddenly a lot of school districts in Europe suddenly found they had their parents, Muslim parents, were objecting to the fact that they were teaching evolution in the schools. So a lot of school systems in Europe are doing now the same thing. But it's not because of Christian fundamentalism, it's because of Islamic fundamentalism. That was a surprise to me.
Yeah,
Um,
that is unfortunate. Um, I do want to spend some time talking about just the kind of writing of this, because, like I said, you're an extraordinarily clear writer about particularly difficult issues
thank
to
you.
describe, and I don't just mean the more philosophic things. I think it's hard to describe in clear ways, let's say, a scientific experiment and why one would draw a certain conclusion from the experiment. These things can have a lot of technicalities to them, a lot of
Mm.
context. And I'm wondering, did that come easy to you? Is writing a skill that you've worked to develop? And particularly given that what you were working on was a more academic orientation, I'm particularly interested in the skill of writing for a general audience, because I mean, this is what I always strive for, and I think what this book does is that it's accessible but not dumbed down. You never have the sense of the person's talking down to you or oversimplifying.
Mm.
You have the sense of, oh, I get this thing that I was confused about before. The kind of way like you encounter somebody like Richard Feynman, and it's, you never get the sense of he's like thinks you're an idiot and he's just gonna, give you the way that I feel like when I listen to somebody like who's our generation's Carl Sagan. I forget his name. Uh, I don't know. We have a couple of these pop scientists,
Right. I
um,
can't
and
think either.
yeah, I have mixed feelings about them, but there's still a way in which you feel a little condescended to.
Yeah.
So anyway, what did that process look like for you?
Mm. I mean, I took a lot of time trying to find good examples and trying to find the right examples. And I mean, certainly the William Harvey, example of discovering the circulation of the blood to put at the beginning, I had to, I thought about other examples too there, and that one had, I guess, at some level, that had always struck me as this is really, this is very clear, and it's easy to see how all these pieces fit together and how his reasoning proceeds from these pieces. And I thought this is really a great example to show of science at its best. And sure, there are a lot of others you could find, but that's one that kind of had struck me in my reading, and over the years, that's one that always kind of impressed me.
That's,
Um,
I mean, that's a good. I just want to pause on that for a second, because that's something that I don't think I've talked about um, that much, which is that there's kind of the clarity of your kind of writing skill set, but then there's like picking the right things to write about, and
yeah,
and that's often been the kind of time consuming part for my work. It was,
mhm,
how do I convey this point? What is the right example to use? Like, um, once you find it, like, life can be a lot easy, but the more, let's say, you don't have a clear cut example, because I just remember in Leonard Peikoff's course, Objective Communication, he really stresses this idea of, you don't want your examples to be more controversial, and I would put in parentheses, or more confusing than the point they're meant to illustrate. So if you want to say,
absolutely.
human beings have individual rights, let's talk about the right to abortion. Now, objectivists argue that, like, abortion is a right, but you can't even wrap your head around that argument until you get the clear cut case of a person stabbing you in the chest or something, or taking your car, right? You need center of the page, clear cut examples in order to grasp a principle. And then only once you have a principle can you deal with complexity. So, like, if you're introducing somebody to scientific experiments and you started with, something that was, Boyle's, the discovery of Boyle's laws, and just jumped into those, my guess is that would be a challenge.
Yeah, yeah. Um, Yeah, I mean, I think throughout the book, I think I thought very carefully about exactly what examples to give, and making sure that they were clear examples, and didn't bring up unnecessarily other issues that I didn't want to bring in at that point. Um, I think regarding writing, I mean, I've never found writing to be an easy process. When I went to Indiana University and I had to write tons of essays for all these classes, that's the first time I really had to do a lot of writing within a fairly short period of time. And then as an academic, you learn a certain kind of writing, which most people would find extremely dry, and it can get very convoluted. So it's not what I would call good writing, and it's definitely not the kind of writing that's in my book here. Um, I think to get my writing style better, I guess I can credit a number of things. Is Certainly Leonard Peikoff has given some lectures over the years, and I certainly paid a lot of attention to those. Um, and then at a certain point, I did get into the Ayn Rand Institute's Objectivist Academic Center. And I spent 2 years. I took two-year-long classes with that. One was with Onkar Ghate, on OPAR, and the second year was the one that was most valuable, and that was writing. And I found that extremely valuable because it was just a lot of feedback about how to think about writing, thinking about doing a lot of reverse outlining, and then writing a lot of things, and then getting the good kind of feedback about how to make a really clear argument, and how to edit properly. I mean, learning how to do a lot of editing. And then I think I've gotten better over the years. I've submitted a few articles to, I submitted to one article to Intellectual Activists during its last couple of years, and then to the Objective Standard, and I get a lot of feedback from the editors there, and just taking into account all that feedback, and then just making sure I carefully edit and edit again, and just go through lots of rounds of editing, and bearing in mind, well, what would somebody else think reading this, and what are all of these external words that I should get rid of that don't belong here. Most writing has tons of this extraneous garbage of words all over the place, and so a big part of the process of editing is getting rid of all that garbage, and just sort of honing in on it. And that's taken me a lot of. I mean, it took me a lot of work to get it to the point where it is now. So,
I mean, that's one of the intriguing things. I think it's true of any skill that one masters. Is part of being good at it is making it look like it didn't take a lot of effort. It's
yeah,
one reason we can watch like great athletes, and people have the same. He makes it look easy. Like you make it look easy and effortless, but to get to that stage, it's not. It's the kind of painstaking work of, do I really know what I mean with this word? Do I really need it? What is my reader going to connect this to that I'm not even thinking about because I'm focused on,
right,
Greece, and he's thinking about this argument. There's that kind of
right,
ongoing questioning. And particularly, I always struggle most with structure. And I mean, your book, part of what's so fascinating about it is that you're able to span thousands of years and a wide swath of issues, and yet it doesn't feel kind of like being dragged in every direction. I mean, there, in part, you build upon a historic progression, but not only a historic progression. And so it's, yeah, I think that's just helpful for people to know, one, so they have expectations, when they go to write, that, well, like, yes, if you're struggling and it's not coming out right, that's what it looks like to write well.
yeah,
It looks like that, rather than sitting down and having beautiful prose pour out. And even when beautiful prose pours out, I think you're exactly right that I've finished many writing sessions saying, oh, that went really well, and it did go really well. But then you revisit it and you go, I can cut that, I can cut that, I can cut that. I don't
right,
know what that is, and but that's why it's. I think if people really want to write, and that's something that they're serious, even if it's not their career, but they want to do something like you did, where they're going to write a book or something. Um, you can't view editing as a chore. At times, it will feel like a chore. I'm wrapping up work on my novel. I was sure I had finished it, and 2 weeks
mhm,
before the deadline, my editor came back with major rewrite suggestions, and unfortunately convinced me that he was right and that it will make the book a lot better. And
mhm,
so at this point, having revised an entire novel like 12 times, that's not fun. But
right,
if your view of editing, I think, just per se is, oh no, I don't like that part, you should probably think if maybe there's other formats like speaking or videos or something where it's not inherently about the revisiting and recrafting and fine tuning of the material.
And
Um,
yeah, I have to say also, I mean, I don't know exactly when this started, but at a certain point, I noticed that if I edit it, and I know how to edit now, and I go back and I look at something I've written, or at least I've edited, go through some editing, some paragraphs or some pages, and then I go back and look at what's done after I'm editing. It's an amazing sense of accomplishment when I like the way I polish something, and I'm very happy about that. That's something I do really enjoy about editing, is getting a piece of writing and then, and walking away knowing I've really improved that. I've really improved that sentence or that paragraph, and that's yeah, something very enjoyable.
yeah, I mean, I don't think writers talk enough about, not every writer does this, but more writers than you think. And I will certainly admit to it, which is when I finish something, I really like it, I'm going to read it several times just for the pleasure of thinking that that's really something I'm proud of and happy with.
Yeah.
Um, and then sometimes I'll read it, 10 years later and go, "Ah, this could have been better." And that's, that's progress. Um, what are, I, I guess as we're wrapping up, what are some issues that maybe you didn't get a chance to go into in the book that you find intriguing and relevant to this, but maybe didn't fit in here, or that you didn't think of till later? What's kind of s- anything that you think has been intriguing or clarifying to you about understanding the conflict between religion and science?
Well, the major omission of my book, I think, at this point, is a chapter about um, religion and um, modern medicine. That's probably should be a chapter in at some point. I think I'm thinking at some point I can add that, because I talk very little about medicine in general in this book, other than just a little bit about what was going on in the ancient world and some of their developments and some things done by um, some of the Muslim scholars. So I think when I have time to do some more research and really put together a good chapter at some point in the future, I'd like to come out with a second edition of the book with that chapter on modern medicine, because there's tons of examples of the quote unquote complaints about playing God and what's all
Mm.
going on there. So I'm sure there's tons of material on that. And the other thing I think might be helpful to a lot of readers might be like some sort of appendix or some other appendix to this book, or something I could put on my website, um, giving lists of various, how should I say, mistaken views that people have about conflicts, where there isn't that people don't really understand the conflict, or there isn't such a conflict as people think. So there are specific examples of conflicts between science and religion that have been specified as historical fact, that a lot of people still think are, but are not quite right. So, I mean, just to put one kind of obvious example, if you look at these books by, sometimes you will hear people say that the church was saying that the earth is flat, and Columbus came around and proved that the earth was round.
Right.
Right? You'll hear people say that, and that's actually even promoted by this book by, for example, Andrew D. White and John Dixon, which were very popular books in the 19th century about conflict between science and religion. And that's just wrong, and people should know that that's wrong. That the Catholic Church has been, wedded ever since Ptolemy back in the first or second century A.D. The Catholic Church was clearly clear that their view is that the Earth is a ball, is a sphere, So
I hope you
there are other.
do. I hope you do the medicine one. Because I think so. It's very easy to underplay the importance of this conflict if we're only thinking in historical terms, where the scientific view, even if it hasn't fully won out, is still available, still guiding scientists. But if you think in the medical realm, part of what it allows you to see is, in effect, what position people were in when Galileo's fate is kind of being determined, right? Are these ideas, and then we can talk about inventions and things, ever going to see the light of day? And if you think about that, the conflict between, between science and medicine, there's a real question of like, will we, or how fast will we get the benefits of something like,
Mhm.
genetic engineering and CRISPR and all of these potential things that could happen
Right.
and that brush up against faith-based ideas. And I think it drives home the deep urgency of these issues in a way that can feel more remote when you're thinking, well, it's just, yeah, of course, the earth goes around the sun, like, and the truth wins out. Well, it's the truth wins out to the degree that there's freedom, and to the degree that there's not, it's only we got lucky that in effect explains why the thinkers were able to, I think, move their ideas along. I luck may be a little bit overstating it, because there's always going to be people who value the truth and who will try to carve out for themselves the space to think and the space to get at the truth. So it's a little bit more than luck, but it's kind of virtue that successfully avoided getting crushed, and that's the sense
Mhm.
in which it's luck.
Mhm.
Well, Fred, I really wish you the best on this. I highly encourage people to pick it up if they're at all interested in these views, including if they disagree with it. I think even to get a new way to think about these issues is really helpful. Where can people find out about the book, about you, and make sure that they can get
Um,
themselves a copy?
I think the best place is, I have a website, godversusnaturebook.com. And there people can read the preface of the book and the table of contents. And there's a blog there, which I hopefully will put more information about the book there. And of course, they can always just go to Amazon and just look up the book, God versus Nature, um, and you should find it there.
All right. Thanks for joining me, Fred.
Thanks so much for having me.